Hello and welcome to the Wake Up Call podcast. Today I'm speaking with Dr. Ed Stringham about the police, deaths at the hands of police, the Black Lives Matter group, and the Blue Lives Matter group. Dr. Stringham is the K.W. Davis Professor of Economic Organizations and Innovation at Trinity College in Connecticut. He is the author of the book Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life, and of the articles Is America Facing a Police Crisis? And America's Out-of-Control Cop Kill Rate. You can find most of his academic articles at ssrn.com, and you can also find him on Twitter at Ed Stringham. That's at EDSTRINGHAM, at Ed Stringham. For more information, please see the show notes page for this episode at wakeupcallpodcast.com/police. Ed, welcome to the show.
Adam, thanks so much for having me.
Well, it's a pleasure. Thanks for joining me. So I want to start by looking at the current situation as relates to police and citizens and the way they regard each other. It's obviously been changing a lot, especially recently, but over the last several years too. This issue has been in the news a lot. How would you describe what those relationships look like?
Well, there's kind of an assumption among civic high school classes where they say, well, government exists to serve the public, and the police are very good at advancing this mindset that they're there to serve and protect. But economics, one important lesson I would have to say is just because you assume something doesn't mean people are going to actually do it. So if you ask an unaccountable bureaucrat to do something, it doesn't mean they're going to be acting on your behalf. And unfortunately, I have to say that over the past few years, especially, the unaccountability of police has been increasing, and the antagonism against the public among police has been increasing. So we're at the stage where confidence in police among Gallup polls of Americans is at the lowest point in the past 25 years. So it has been getting worse in terms of public perceptions.
Right, and as you point out in your article, Is America Facing a Police Crisis? This declining confidence in police spans across all demographics. It's not just restricted to African Americans or to young people or to low-income individuals or anything like that. It spans all races, all genders, ages, incomes, education. It's really widespread and throughout the entirety of society.
That's right. So among certain demographic groups, including African Americans or young people in general, they tend to have a lower opinion of the police than older people currently. But there's been a shift, as you mentioned, among all different groups, among the most educated peoples, the most rich peoples, and everybody's opinion of police has been declining over the past 15 years.
So how did we get to this point?
Now, what I do in this article that I had in the Wall Street Journal was I kind of said there's a lot of antagonism. It's a lot of heated debate in terms of some people say, there's so much police killing of citizens. Other people say, there's so many police being killed by citizens. And the debate is very heated. It's actually kind of very emotional. And whatever one position people take, oftentimes the other side says, oh, you're inciting violence, you're in favor of crime. And so what I did is actually kind of tried to take a step back and, as an economist, look at the actual data, look at the actual facts, and calculate how much people are being killed. So my own position is we want to minimize killings in society. And we can then calculate the rate at which people are killed and killing to see and put those numbers into perspective. Well, it turns out that nationwide there's around 900,000 law enforcement officials. But of those people, they end up killing 1 out of 12 Americans who get killed are killed by the police. And at the same time, those 900,000 police officers, 41 of them are slain in the line of duty. So to just put those numbers into perspective, they are 41 of them are being killed. At the same time, they're killing 1,200 Americans. So it is quite a very big, striking difference in those statistics that should give people pause right off the bat.
Well, it definitely should. And what do the trends look like with this? The conventional wisdom seems to be that both police deaths and deaths at the hands of the police are growing. But is that true? How do today's figures compare to what we've seen in the past?
Well, the police are notoriously, well, at this point, it's quite obvious that they underreport the number of people they killed. And some very important databases on these topics are done by the Washington Post, and there's another one, Killed by Police. And what they are doing is actually trying to shed light on this topic, to actually show the figures. The past few years that they've been documenting it, police killings of citizens or non-citizens alike, but just of civilians, has been increasing. At the same time, society-wide crime has been decreasing, and it's also the same thing for police who are slain in the line of duty. There's actually very good data on that, spanning back years, and right now, despite what people say in the media, it's very safe to be a police officer. It's never been safer. And so what I do is calculate the risk at which people die and to killing, and it turns out that police die at a rate of 4.6 out of 100,000, and the average American dies at an almost identical rate of 4.5 per 100,000. So we're talking about 4.6 and 4.5 per 100,000. And then if you look at the average American male, it is actually 6.6 per 100,000. So it's actually more dangerous to be an average American male than it is to be a police officer.
Wow, and one of the things that you look at in your other article, America's Out of Control Cop Kill Rate, is how the rate of deaths at the hands of police compares across countries, and also how the rate of deaths of police in the U.S. compares to overall homicide rates in other countries. So what has your research uncovered about those comparisons?
Yeah, it's actually quite shocking there, too, to actually look at the rate at which police kill is upwards of 150 per 100,000. Okay, so overall the police, the homicide rate is 4.5, and police are killing between 135 or 150 Americans per 100,000 officers. So we're talking about a homicide rate or a kill rate 36 times higher than the average American. Now, a lot of people say, "Oh, well, the police, they need to do that. It's necessary." But if you look at other countries, it's actually quite shocking. The police do not kill at nearly anything that rate. In plenty of countries like Iceland, I think it's reported that there's been 0 police against citizens killings. Japan, I forget the statistic right now, but maybe 1 in a very long period. And then other countries like England, Germany, have a much lower police kill against citizen kill rate. So it's actually quite an anomaly in the United States. The police kill at a higher rate than people who are in the most dangerous countries in the world.
Do you know what the statistics are for police deaths, for police being killed in other countries, and how that compares to the U.S.?
That's an interesting question, and I don't have that data right now. But my guess is, in general, it would also be lower. I think one of the big issues in the United States, it's really kind of ramped up over the past few decades, is the police have increasingly viewed citizens as enemy combatants. So in the article in the Wall Street Journal, I review 4 books, and one of them, which I think is great, is by a former police chief named Norm Stamper. And his book's called To Serve and Protect. And he talks about how he started out as a beat cop and then worked his way up to become a police chief in Seattle. And he noticed over time that with things like the drug war, the antagonism among the police towards the public increased. So the whole term war, it implies enemy combatants. And when we're talking about the war on drugs and we're talking about enemy combatants, we're talking about the police having a war on Americans. And so with that, we've seen huge increases in incarceration that you don't see increasing in other countries, specifically places like Canada. You also see increase during this time, this might be related, but perhaps not, but it's almost certainly related in my opinion, is increasing militarization of the police. So once you get this idea that we're going to have this, a war, we're going to need more weapons, the police have become more and more militarized over the past few decades, and that's especially ramped up starting in the 1990s with the crime bill that Bill Clinton passed. So that added 100,000 more police onto the streets, and along with it, they started transferring surplus military equipment. So the police love getting hand-me-downs from the military and like grenade launchers, the equivalent of tanks, all types of things, rifles, all these things that you don't assume policemen needs, now they have. And especially over the past 15 years now, there's also a Department of Homeland Security grant system where they're giving money to local police departments to buy what I would and most people would call military equipment. So it's really kind of ramped up over the past 20 years.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about the role the war on drugs has played in contributing to this problem, as well as this issue of police militarization and just how bad that situation has gotten?
Yeah, so in some abstract sense, we think about the police as there to, walk down the street to prevent some problems from getting out of hand. So the whole idea of the police foot patrols, this is kind of at this point, a mythical view of old-fashioned policing. But what's happened really is now the police are not doing their job to necessarily serve people or protect people, but they're viewing people as numbers. So in To Serve and Protect by Norm Stamper, he talks about how when he started his job, it wasn't long before he realized that he was being rated, and his supervisors as well were being rated based on numbers. So to show their productivity, they had to make a certain number of arrests, make a certain number of tickets, different types of field interrogations. And a very easy way to do that is to target people who are using drugs. So people who otherwise you wouldn't be interacting with them, they're just minding their own business. Now all of a sudden they're a potential target for the police. So it's an excuse basically for them to get in everybody's business if there's suspicion. In the New York City area specifically, they ramped up warrantless stop and frisk, where they would basically pull over anybody without any due cause or without any warrant to just say, well, you might have weapon on you, you might have drugs on you, and because of these things are contraband, they were allowed to stop and frisk hundreds of thousands of people. Turns out the vast majority of these were completely warrantless. They were eventually found to be in violation of people's human rights, and they've had to phase that out over the past few years. So that is one beneficial ramping down of this. But the whole idea that the police now can do so many more things than they used to. And as part of this, I'm going to mention as well the asset forfeiture law. Starting in the 1990s, police have now been able to seize somebody's private property without even petitioning a judge, without even petitioning a court, without establishing any guilt whatsoever. And it's very difficult for somebody to get that back, and in many cases they will try and fight it. But with small value items, there's not much that people can do. And then you add into that the whole war on drugs thing. When everybody is assumed to be a criminal, the police can then go around, target people who they think might likely have drugs, and then say, oh, well, that person also has a nice car. Let's actually go after that. So at this point, there's higher dollar value of police forfeiture from private citizens than there are private burglaries in the entire United States.
Wow, well, that's a staggering statistic. But when we talk about the police viewing citizens as enemy combatants, which is something you said earlier, I think it's important to take a look at how police used to view citizens. So what did that look like? I think most people have this idea that that it's like something out of the Andy Griffith show with the Barney Fife character. Was that the case? What exactly did that look like?
Yeah, I mean, that's kind of the, that's probably also exaggerated, but that is the old mythology. But if you look at now, even in their own eyes, the way police are portrayed in modern times, it's definitely much more tough guy, militaristic. Let's go bang some heads, smash some skulls. It's actually, like you can see this showing up in the television shows. You can see this in the way they're dressing. So they're not dressing in a blue uniform with a what might be called a nice hat. Instead, they're wearing helmets from war. They're wearing camouflage, fatigues. I don't understand why people would be needing to wear camouflage, which is used for jungle, in the middle of American streets, other than to show how tough they are and to show how militaristic they are. So the idea that they can then parade around with their rifles drawn, you could see that after the protest against police in Ferguson, Missouri, when people were upset. And basically the police came out in like full force, military formations, guns ablaze. So the idea that we've got Andy Griffith there to pull the cat out of the tree, we've just moved so far behind that. They're still kind of pushing that mentality. Bill Clinton was saying, oh, yeah, we're going to get more community policing with his 1990s crime bill, but it really was just hiring more militarized police.
Right, and of course, go along the lines with the police militarization, we see little towns and small remote counties with police departments that have MRAPs and Bearcats and drones and all sorts of very heavy and powerful military equipment. So it really is alarming, and it really has gone out of control.
Yeah,
go ahead.
A lot of people say that, police it's a local issue, and a lot of conservatives will say, well, obviously the federal government is out of control. You can't trust them. They're unaccountable. They're a bunch of bureaucrats. But they say, well, the police are local. It's the local government. We can trust them. But it's been increasingly federalized in terms of the federal government is now determining local criminal law, how local police must charge certain people, whether they like it or not, how judges must incarcerate people, whether they like it or not. And then at the same time, the federal government is financing local police departments. So now all of a sudden, even if people were, thinking their local police department was going to be a little bit kinder and gentler than a federal agency, we've basically contracted this out. It's now financed by the federal government. They're marching to the tune of the federal government. And one of the things that Americans were so upset about in during the time of the American Revolution was having standing armies. We didn't want standing armies from a remote authority marching on our soil. And now we basically have these fully militarized police departments, which look pretty much like an army to me.
Right, and on the subject of how police view citizens, it has been said before, and I think you mentioned this in your article, in your more recent article in the Wall Street Journal, is America facing a police crisis, which of course will be linked at wakeupcallpodcast.com/police, but that the primary police objectives are extracting revenue sources, as you touched upon with the asset forfeiture in part, and officer safety, and that the protect and serve mantra is not really as big a part of this as maybe it once was, or maybe popular culture would have us believe.
Yeah, so that's one of the most important lessons from economics, is to look at people's incentives. If people have no incentive to serve their customer, imagine a business is going to get paid regardless of whether the customer is happy, and they're paid based on union pay scale. And even if they abuse the customer, they can still get pay increases. And so this is what's happened with police. There's very little negative incentives for police misconduct. When police step out of line, their colleagues are very reluctant to tell on each other. There's the thin blue line. They don't want to harm their friends. They also don't want to face negative repercussions. If somebody's a whistleblower, they can get in trouble among their friends or even their not so friends. So when they're on a call, all of a sudden nobody cooperates with them. At the same time, you've got the prosecutors who are allegedly working from a different branch of government. So allegedly you have the law enforcement part, you've got the judicial part, you've got the different parts of prosecutors, and these people are supposed to be pursuing their jobs independently, looking at the rule of law, things like that. But in practicality, the prosecutors work closely with the police. They need them to testify, to get convictions. So they're basically buddies working alongside each other, each having an incentive to back each other up. In many cases, there's a quote in the book by another police chief where he describes how thousands of police officers each year engage in testifying, where they're just basically helping the prosecutor get convictions without regards to any justice. So that's a major problem. And then, well, what about the judges? Well, it turns out the judges also are hired by the government, and they work alongside the prosecutors and the police. And so if you want to read a very horrifying document, is written actually by the federal government, a report of the police and the law enforcement and the courts in Ferguson, Missouri. And it just goes through and shows how the police, the prosecutors, the judges all worked alongside each other to collect fines. So in a city with 20,000 people, they had 9,000, I think it was warrants or arrests. I forget the exact statistic I'm putting there, but basically half the people, if you assume it's one per person. And we're talking about criminal charges against people, for example, for having an overgrown lawn. And we know from the findings of this that they're actually working to increase revenue for the city. There was records of them saying, hey, we're not having a good tax season this year. Do you police think you can increase the revenue a little bit? And they said, yeah, we'll try. And so it's very explicit. The idea that they're working for us versus working for them, we really need to pay attention to this.
Sure. Now, before we look at the Blue Lives Matter and Black Lives Matter groups, I want to ask you about one more topic that sometimes comes up when explaining how this problem came about. And a lot of people on the left in particular bring this point up, but that is of the building of new prisons and the introduction of private prisons. So is there any merit to the claim that that prisons and their increase and privatization so-called privatization has played a role in creating this issue, or is there no merit to that?
I think the increase in incarceration in the United States is a huge travesty. We've seen a huge increase compared to Canada, for example, and at the same time, Canadian homicide rates and American homicide rates, even though they start at different levels, they track each other, they're correlated with each other, almost one-to-one. So we don't need to see this huge increase in incarceration to see the decreases in, for example, homicides that you've seen in Canada. I do think that there is this big, let's just lock everyone up, throw away the key type of mentality. Behind that are the police people, the prison guards unions. I do think part of it are these firms that live with the government, and I'm hesitant to call these even private prisons, but I will refer to that for a minute. But the private prisons who are getting their money from the government, incarcerating people, working at the behest of government, I think they're making, I would say, undue money. But I do think that that's a small piece of the problem, and I forget the statistic, but it's less than 10% of federal prisons, something like that. And it's been in the news recently, and I forget the exact statistic. But it is relatively small. There's a much bigger problem of just huge increases in incarceration rates over the past 25 years. California didn't even really increase the number of prisons that much. Yet they just kept packing more and more people in. So I think it's a bigger problem. I think that one of the main culprits are the 3 strikes laws, mandatory minimum laws that were signed by Bill Clinton in the 1990s. I think it's a huge, huge issue, and anything that contributes to it, including these so-called private prisons, I think is bad. But I will emphasize that I think if something is financed by the government, it's financed by taxpayers. Their, quote, customers are there because of the government. They're being forced there by the government, and they're involuntary customers. I don't think that we should really be referring to these, quote, private prisons as private prisons, because they're actually being paid for by the government and operating at the behest of the government. So it is a slightly misleading term.
Sure. So I want to turn our attention now to the Black Lives Matter and Blue Lives Matter groups. So what are these groups? Who's in them? Where did they come from? And do these groups have any merits? So with a lot of things, you'll start seeing people getting together around some common themes, some common complaints, and then later, especially with an unorganized group, or even with an organized group for that matter, you'll see other people coming in and morphing the original ideas, adding a little different things. So I'd say for anything, especially these ones, especially the Black Lives Matter, you can probably find people within it who hold all types of views all over the spectrum. But initially, a lot of the people in the Black Lives Matter movement, and probably to this day, maybe a very significant percentage, were concerned with police violence. And I think this is a very legitimate and important concern that they had, that they would say, we need to stop this. African Americans live in constant fear of being pulled over or harassed or in many cases killed by the police. And some of the original sets of the demands from these people were very much focused on police violence. And that's a set of things which I think are very good, very important, and I would agree with 100%. Now, in addition to that, there's other people who've got along, and they're using that phrase to basically come up with a laundry list of the things that they want, like, let's increase the minimum wage. Well, to me, I would say keep those two arguments separate. Keep a pro-minimum wage group versus an anti-police violence group separate,
because I think once they start getting into more strict economic questions, they start the other people who are talking about the economics of the minimum wage are not really doing it from a very maybe sophisticated perspective. So that's one thing to think about. In addition, there's a lot of people who take different approaches. So, we've got historically in the United States some examples of peaceful, nonviolent protests, and then you've got other people who are rioters and destroying things. And I do think that the latter approach is not very persuasive to most people, because it just gets a lot of external observers to say, well, look at these people. They're just they just want disorder in society. So I think within any movement, you're going to see a huge range, and it's just an unfortunate fact.
Sure, and as regards the Black Lives Matter group, I think there's a lot of merit to sort of the initial points they were making, and of course there are a lot of high-profile cases to draw attention to this issue. The Michael Brown case in Ferguson, Eric Garner in Staten Island. In Ohio, you had Tamir Rice, and then you had Timothy Russell and Melissa Williams. So there have been a lot of high-profile cases that back up a lot of the initial claims that they made, and that drew a lot of attention to their to this issue. But and just to play devil's advocate here, it could be said that it misses the boat in some ways in 2 points, and I'm talking about what the group initially stood for, I guess we could say. It's kind of morphed into some other things. But first of all is that police violence against citizens is not just limited to blacks, and while it might take place against blacks at a disproportionately high rate compared to the black population in the United States, more whites are killed by police than blacks, as far as the hard numbers go, as pointed out by those killed by police statistics you cited earlier. And those cases have not, for the most part, been quite as high profile. But white people, Hispanics, Asians, people of all sorts of groups are killed by police, have been killed by police. And the other point it misses is when it says Black Lives Matter, and it uses the terminology Black Lives. It means that it should also be discussing problems in inner cities in Chicago, Baltimore, elsewhere, of homicide rates against African Americans there, and that group by and large doesn't address that issue.
So I kind of agree with some of your points, and I don't fully agree with all of them. So in terms of the statistics, you are correct that all groups are killed by police, and I think really for me the main thing is being against unnecessary killing. I think is very important, and so that's the most important thing. It is true, however, so I'm going to defend them for a minute, that disproportionately in certain areas there's more police presence, there's more police harassing them. In New York, for example, the police will focus on areas where they basically think people are up to no good. Quote, that's from Heather McDonald's book, she's a pro-defender of the police. And she says, well, they know they're up to no good. Well, if up to no good is defined by the police, well, they can then go in there and say, all right, well, these are easy targets. We can harass these people. So if they're selling drugs, we can go after them. So I do think that police violence against all people and police harassment against all people is important, but it might be the case, and I think there's pretty good evidence on this, that they do, African Americans are more likely to encounter police, even if they're completely innocent. So this is just an anecdotal statistic, but still really horrifying, that was in the news the other day, of an African American homeowner who had his home broken into. He called the police, and the police just arrived very quickly and shot him. So that is kind of an assumption that a lot of police officers tend to have, is who are the good guys, who are the bad guys. In the book by Norm Stamper, he actually says that police is a breeding ground of racism. It is a breeding ground of mistreatment of people. And if the police are more likely to be stationed in an inner city where there's a lot of African Americans, the African Americans are the ones who are going to be seeing a lot of the brunt of that. So I do think that the police, anti-police violence and anti-police mistreatment of citizens is a very important.
Sure, and despite what I just said, I will say to the extent that the Black Lives Matter group addresses that issue, that is definitely a positive development, and there definitely does seem to be profiling, maybe racism on the part of police in many cases. But I want to turn our attention to the Blue Lives Matter group. What is the Blue Lives Matter group, and what is the so-called war on cops that ties into this organization?
So Heather McDonald is a fellow who writes a lot of books and articles defending the police, and she has this recent one called The War on Cops, and she says that there's this anti-police sentiment, and you can hear that among a lot of politicians, and it's also especially common among police unions. So it's the idea of, hey, you guys are criticizing us for committing violence, but we're actually the only ones here protecting people. And rather than focusing on Black Lives Matter, you need to be looking at us who are risking our lives on the front line. And so their basic sentiment is pretty much all of the police killings, they would say, are justified. And they would say any criticisms of the police are going to increase crime because the criminals are going to be able to get away with more things. And they really kind of take this set of argumentation in a very, I have to say, an exaggerated way by saying, oh, it's never been so dangerous to be a police. We're risking our lives out there. We're dying so often. And I would wish that nobody would ever get killed. But just to put things into perspective, as I mentioned, 41 people out of 900,000 is safer than the average American faces. So to say that they're at risk every single second or they're dying at a very high rate, I think is just a little bit exaggerating. And you see that among politicians, you see that among Heather McDonald especially. They'll say, oh, crime has never been so high. We're seeing a nationwide crime wave, and it has to do with the protests against the police. Well, it turns out, I looked at the data from another book, which is a very interesting one by Barry Latzer, who's a criminologist. He looks at the rise and fall of violent crime in America. It turns out that originally the data before the 1930s was very unreliable, so we couldn't make these long-run comparisons because it was collected in different ways. But more recent estimates basically establish as follows. In 1900, homicide rates were basically 4.5 out of 100,000, exactly what they are today. During Prohibition, they increased quite a bit. But during the 1950s, they decreased to basically 4.5 out of 100,000. During the 60s, 70s, they increased again, some upward and downward blips in the 80s. And since the 90s especially, but it's a downward trend starting in the 1980s, we now are at 4.5 deaths per 100,000. So we're basically at among the most safest times in American history in 1900, in the 1950s, and the 2010 range, we're at 4.5 per 100,000. So this whole idea that we're in this nationwide crime wave, things have never been worse. It's really Chicken Littleism. It's really the sky is falling, and I think this is particularly pronounced among a lot of the advocates of the Blue Lives Matter movement.
All right, so with the recent deaths at the hands of the police, or the recent deaths of police at the hands of citizens, particularly in the Twin Cities, Baton Rouge, and Dallas, we've seen even more attention brought to this issue. where do you think all of this is headed on the heels of these recent events, and what solutions do you see to this problem?
Well, anytime anybody gets killed, I'm very dismayed by it because I don't think it's good for anybody. It's just going to lead to more antagonism by both sides. And so somehow, there's been examples of this in history, many of examples of this. In the midst of conflict, people trying to figure out how to de-escalate violence. And I think if the police could start thinking about de-escalating violence, I don't think it's even on their radar screen. There was a Washington Post article, I believe, from a few weeks ago where they asked a gun expert to analyze a bunch of police shootings. They asked a few of them. And the police expert from Los Angeles County Police Department, every single time she said, well, of course they needed to shoot that person. Well, of course, yeah, they needed to do that. So with Tamir Rice was the teenager in Cleveland where the police basically did a drive-by shooting on him. Like, well, yeah, they needed to because what if they got killed? Well, maybe they didn't need to go so quickly. Or when they shot the caregiver recently of an autistic man, the gentleman was basically a nurse with his hands up lying on the ground, and he said, please don't shoot. This man is autistic. He's not armed. I'm not armed. And they shot him anyway. And the lady's like, oh, of course they needed to do that. So right now they're trained in the mentality of if you're at all afraid, shoot. Then they need to claim, well, I was in fear of my life. And we really need to get away from that. 90% of Americans right now think that police should be required to wear cameras. And I think that would be a big step and would somehow need to be able to not have the police be able to turn off the cameras after the fact, throw away the evidence after the fact, because for some surprising reason, lots of this footage is always lost. So it would need to be more reliable. But to kind of shed light on what's going on, I think would be a big step. And then maybe to just say, look, we can't allow this. We can't continue to allow police to kill. I mean, if you compare the amount of deaths of terrorism, which is terrible, over the past 15 years, there's no comparison, actually. It's far, far higher for police killing Americans than Americans being killed by terrorists. So I think if people start looking at the data, start realizing, these are the actual numbers, rather than just listening to some politician who say, oh, this is what's going on. I think it would be the first step in de-escalating violence.
And something you point to in America's out-of-control cop kill rate is the role that cops carrying guns plays, and what that looks like elsewhere, what that looks like here, as well as the number of police. What does that look like, and what solutions do you see regarding the weaponry that cops carry, including guns, and the size of police forces in the U.S.?
Yeah, so my ideal solution is if you don't want to see so much shootings, don't give police not only rifles and tons of rounds of ammunition, but say, look, we don't need you to be armed here. So there's lots of examples in other countries where just police are not carrying guns, and it's a very different system. There was a video I watched recently of a machete-wielding person in England, I believe it was, and the police actually just surrounded him. They had shields, and they actually were able to detain the person, whereas in the United States, that guy would have been shot instantly. I was just in the country of Georgia, former Soviet Union country of Georgia, and there was some gentleman being thrown out of a park, and the police just kind of walked him away, and they said, okay, please leave. And I was just thinking, that's very different. In the United States, that guy would have been slammed to the ground, arrested instantly. So the idea that force is the best way to do things, I think it is a completely wrong assumption. There's lots of people who are trained in the art of de-escalation. If you look to private security, that's really one of the main things that a lot of these groups are good at. And to say we don't need to start breaking heads. We don't need to shoot upon the first thing. And I would just say, let's start moving away from our current system and moving back to what we used to have. Professional police departments really only about 150 years old. We don't need to have them in the same sense that we have them now. We could say, let's just go back to what we had 150 years ago. Or even better, look to the models that you see at Disneyland, for example, or Disney in China. They're totally changing the way law enforcement is done. In China, the police tend to be much more standoffish, and Disney said, no, we don't want to do that. We're going to take care of our own security, and we're going to do it in a very gentle, customer-friendly way. And we can see a lot of that in the United States. There's now more private security officers in the United States than police. And I think we need to be looking at those as alternatives, private alternatives that are not so unionized, they're not so violent, and they're not so unaccountable as people in the public sector.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining me today. If someone is interested in learning more about the topics we've been discussing here, what do you recommend they take a look at? And also, can you talk about your book, Private Governance?
Oh, thanks.
And how you, especially in particular, how you cover issues related to police and private police in there.
Thanks. Yeah, I was going to recommend my book, Private Governance. It's published by Oxford University Press. It's available on Amazon and anywhere else you buy books, and hardcover and Kindle, all of that. And in that, I basically talk about, throughout history, private rules and regulations where the private sector is solving problems that most people assume the government needs to assume. So rather than engaging in speculation and saying, well, this problem must be solved that way or should be solved that way, if you look back in history, there are lots of private examples, things done for profit in a voluntary way. So you can check that out. Also, a lot of my articles are online for free on the website ssrn.com, and you can also follow me on Twitter at @EdStringham.
All right, well, great, and I want to thank you very much for joining me today, and I want to remind everybody that the show notes page for this episode is wakeupcallpodcast.com/police, and of course there will be links there to the book that we just mentioned, Private Governance, Creating Order in Economic and Social Life, and the two articles that we've been touching on over the course of this interview, Is America Facing a Police Crisis? And America's Out-of-Control Cop Kill Rate. And there will also be links to all sorts of other resources and books that have been mentioned over the course of this interview and that are related to the topics we've discussed today. So wakeupcallpodcast.com/police is the show notes page for this episode. And I want to encourage everybody, while they're on the website, to sign up for our email list and to subscribe to the show on iTunes or Stitcher or your preferred podcatcher so you can stay up to date with what's going on with the show and make sure that you can get every episode and that you don't miss any. And Ed, I want to thank you very much for joining me today to discuss a topic that is oh so relevant for better or for worse right now. It's been in the news a lot. There are a lot of tensions, a lot of controversies related to this, and it's a very controversial issue in many ways. So I'm glad we were able to talk about this and take a look at so many different aspects and have a few objections and devil's advocate points and a lot of statistics along the way. So thank you very much for joining me to talk about this, and hopefully we can do it again in the future and talk more about your book, Private Governance.
Adam, thanks so much. Appreciate it. Cheers to you.
All right. Well, thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Wake Up Call podcast.
If you would like to listen to more episodes, please subscribe, rate, and review the show on iTunes or subscribe on Stitcher. And check out our website at wakeupcallpodcast.com.
There you will find show notes pages and comment sections dedicated to the show. You can also email us at contact@wakeupcallpodcast.com if you're interested in being interviewed for the show or have any other suggestions.
Thank you.